As Charlie Brown's dog Snoopy began his story, sitting on the roof of his doghouse typing away, it was a dark and stormy night. And it was indeed a dark and stormy night back in November of 1910 at a New Jersey railway station. And the last southbound train of the day was preparing for departure at around 10 p.m. At a siding near the far end of the platform stood a car that looked very different from the other cars in the railway station. This car had gleaming black paint, brass fittings, and on each side was a plaque with the single word Aldrich. This was the private car of Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, who was one of the most powerful politicians in Washington at the time. He was the Republican whip in the Senate and chairman of the National Monetary Commission. He was an investment associate with J.P. Morgan, and so he was considered to be the political spokesman for big business. He was closely allied with the Rockefellers. His grandson, Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, would eventually become governor of New York and ultimately vice president of the United States. Shortly after Aldrich entered his private car, he was joined by 6 other men. These men were instructed to arrive separately, pretend that they did not know each other, and avoid any reporters. They had also been told that once inside the car, they were to address each other only by their first names, so that the porters and servants inside the car would not be able to know who they were. These 7 men represented an estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world at that time. So who were these 6 other guys besides Senator Aldrich? The first was Abraham Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury. The second was Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, which was the most powerful bank at the time, and he was there to represent William Rockefeller. The third person was Henry Davison, senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. The fourth person was Charles Norton, president of J.P. Morgan's First National Bank of New York. The fifth gentleman was Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And if you're getting the impression that J.P. Morgan's a heavy hitter in this financial world, he must have been. And the last one was Paul Warburg, a partner of Kuhn Loeb and Company, and he was representing the Rothschild banking dynasty of England and France. And speaking of the Rothschild dynasty, it's worthy to note at this point that one of the Rothschilds was supposed to have said, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." As it turns out, that was a hint as to what these guys were up to. After Aldrich's private car was coupled to the train that was heading south that night, this group embarked on a 1,000-mile journey down to the town of Brunswick, Georgia. Just off the coast from Brunswick was an island that had become popular as a winter resort for the wealthy up north. This particular island had just been purchased by J.P. Morgan and some of his business associates, and it was called Jekyll Island, hence the name of G. Edward Griffin's book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, if some of you are familiar with that or maybe even have read it. After arrival at the remote island lodge, the secrecy continued. For 9 days, these men continued to address each other only by their first names. The regular full-time staff of the lodge had been dismissed for that period of time, and a whole new crew came in, specially screened crew of servants and caretakers. This was done to ensure that none of the servants might identify who was there and then spill the beans to the media or the public. Because if word had gotten out that rival factions of the banking community were meeting together, then the public would have been alerted to the possibility that these bankers were conspiring to limit competition or figure out a way to increase profits or who knows what else. And as it turned out, that's exactly what they were doing. Out of this meeting came the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. And at this point, you may be wondering, well, if this meeting was so secret, then how do we know that it even took place? Well, as Ben Franklin said, 3 can keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. And eventually, a secret comes out. And the first leak about this meeting came out in 1916, 6 years after the meeting and 3 years after the Federal Reserve Act was enacted in 1913. And it appeared in an article written by a young financial reporter by the name of B.C. Forbes, who later went on to found Forbes magazine. And the article was primarily in praise of Paul Warburg, who apparently let the story out in conversations with the reporter, because the first paragraph of the article basically was a summary of the nature and purpose of the meeting. But later, Paul Warburg himself published a book in 1930 entitled The Federal Reserve System, Its Origin and Growth, in which he described the meeting and its purpose. And then in 1935, in an edition of the Saturday Evening Post, there appeared another article written by another member of that group, Frank Vanderlip, and he gave in that article all the details that I've described to you up to this point. What those guys worked out on Jekyll Island was essentially an agreement on the structure and operation of a banking cartel. And as all cartels are designed to do, they were trying to maximize profits by minimizing competition with each other. Well, why were they doing this? What was going on back then to make them feel that they needed to do this? For one thing, the number of banks was growing phenomenally. Just in the 10 years from 1900 to 1910, the number of banks had doubled to 20,000. And most of these banks were springing up in the South and in the West, and they were providing competition to the big New York banks and taking some of their market share. So the big New York bankers wanted to stop this and reverse it if they could. Competition was also coming from a trend in industry to finance growth out of profits rather than through loans from banks. And in fact, by 1910, something like 70% of the funding for private corporations was coming from their own retained earnings and not from banks. And the federal government was even becoming thrifty. They were increasing their hoard of gold. They were paying down the national debt. And so the bankers wanted to try to stop and reverse this trend toward reducing bank debt in the private and the public sector. But the biggest threat came from the general public in the form of bank runs, which happened when people start to lose confidence in a bank and they run back to the bank to take their money out because they're worried that if they don't move quickly, they won't be able to get all of their money out. And this usually happened because back in those days there weren't strict regulations on banking that they have today. There was no deposit insurance, so people got a little bit nervous at times, especially if they heard that a bank had suffered a big loan loss. And then they would lose confidence and run down to the bank, and that in turn would maybe cause bank runs on other banks. And when that would snowball, it would cause a financial panic. And just such a panic took place in October of 1907. And there was a serious threat to the economy at that point, and J.P. Morgan organized a team of bankers that stepped in and helped meet the crisis. So within a matter of weeks, the crisis passed, and faith and confidence in the economy was eventually restored. But Congress was concerned by this. They didn't like the idea that the fate of the national economy rested on one guy, J.P. Morgan, who kind of rode to the rescue. So Congress passed legislation in May of 1908 that established the National Monetary Commission to investigate the panic and propose some ideas to regulate banking to make sure that that wouldn't happen again.